failure. That's all you'll ever be, Mom. Those words hit me like a slap across the face, delivered with such venom by my own son that the entire dinner table fell silent for a heartbeat before erupting in uncomfortable laughter. His wife, that smirking, entitled witch, squeezed his arm and gave me a look of pure satisfaction, as if she'd been waiting months to witness this moment of my public humiliation. The guests around our dining table, relatives, friends, business associates, they all thought this was just another family squabble. Another case of a difficult old woman being put in her place by her long-suffering son. They saw me sitting there in my thrift store dress, my gray hair pulled back in a simple bun, my hands folded quietly in my lap, and they made their assumptions. Poor Clara. Helpless Clara. Useless Clara who depends on her son's charity to survive. My name is Clara. I'm 64 years old. And in that moment, everyone in that room thought I was just a powerless old woman at the mercy of her ungrateful son. They were so very, very wrong. I reached into my purse with steady hands that weren't shaking despite the rage burning in my chest, and pulled out a black leather folder. I placed it on the white tablecloth with deliberate care, right next to the expensive china and crystal glasses that everyone assumed my son had paid for. Before I open this folder and change everything forever, I said, my voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room, take a moment to subscribe, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Because what happens next will show you exactly what happens when people mistake kindness for weakness. The folder sat there like a loaded gun while I looked directly at my son's flushed face. The anger was still there. Oh God, the anger was eating me alive from the inside, but my voice came out ice cold and steady. Before I open this, David, I want you to do something for me. I turned to his wife, watching her confident smirk start to falter. Explain to your wife why her jewelry allowance ends today. Explain to your in-laws why they're about to lose their fancy roof. I gestured to his business partner sitting across from us. And explain to Marcus why his career is already dead. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. David's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no sound came out. His wife Sarah grabbed his arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his expensive suit jacket. Mom, what are you talking about? David finally managed, but his voice cracked on the last word. I could see the fear creeping into the faces around the table. The comfortable assumptions they'd made about powerless old Clara were starting to crumble, and they didn't understand why. They were about to find out that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimates. You'll find out soon enough, I said softly. But first, let me tell you a story about a woman who spent years playing a role she never wanted to play. For 3 years, I lived like a ghost of myself. 3 years of pretending to be poor, helpless, dependent. 3 years of wearing clothes from thrift stores when my real wardrobe hung untouched in a closet across town. 3 years of walking everywhere because I'd hidden my car, taking buses when my joints ached, carrying heavy grocery bags when I could have afforded to have everything delivered. The pain of it, not just the physical discomfort, but the emotional agony of watching my own son treat me like garbage, it nearly broke me some days. There were nights I lay in that tiny rented flat, staring at the water stains on the ceiling, wondering if I was making the biggest mistake of my life. Wondering if maybe I should just reveal the truth and try to rebuild our relationship on honest ground. But every Sunday, when David would pick me up for family dinner, all my doubts would disappear. Because every Sunday, he would remind me exactly who he really was underneath that charming exterior he showed the world. Come on, Mom, time to go, he'd say, barely glancing at me as I climbed into his Mercedes. Try not to embarrass us today, okay? He'd seat me on that wobbly stool he dragged up from the basement, never at the actual dining table with the adults. Never worthy of the good chairs or the good china. The cruel irony? The dining room set he was so proud of? I'd bought it. The house we were sitting in? My money had purchased it. The car that carried us there? Registered in my name, though he didn't know it. David would hold court at these dinners, playing the role of the generous son to perfection. "We give Mom $400 a month so she won't starve," he'd announce to anyone who'd listen, his chest puffed out with manufactured pride. "It's not much, but we do what we can for family." For $100. The cost of one of Sarah's weekly shopping sprees. Less than they spent on wine in a month. And the guests would nod approvingly, praising David's kindness while shooting me pitying glances. Sarah was even worse. She'd parade her latest purchases in front of me like trophies, $1,000 handbags, designer shoes, jewelry that cost more than most people made in a year. "Oh, Clara, I bought you something too," she'd say with fake sweetness, then present me with a clearance rack scarf or a box of discount chocolates. "I thought you might like something pretty for once." The gifts I gave them, handmade scarves I'd knitted, photo albums I'd carefully assembled, home-baked goods made with love, were received with barely concealed disgust. I watched Sarah throw my creations in the trash when she thought I wasn't looking. I heard David joke to his friends about his pitiful mother and her pathetic little presents. But the worst part? The absolute worst part was how their social circle treated me. The parties where I was introduced as David's poor mother before being forgotten in a corner. The conversations that stopped when I approached, then resumed in whispers once I'd passed. The way people spoke about me like I wasn't even there. "She's such a burden," I heard one of Sarah's friends say at a Christmas party. "I don't know how David manages it. Taking care of an elderly parent is so expensive." If only they'd known that the expensive burden they were discussing had more money than all of them combined. The mask of civility David wore in public started slipping more and more as the months went on. Success, it seemed, had made him even crueler. His construction company was thriving thanks to the initial investment and ongoing financial backing I'd provided secretly through shell companies, and with each new contract, each new project, his arrogance grew. "Look at this spread," he'd say at dinner parties, gesturing grandly at the feast laid out on the table. "This is what hard work gets you. This is what happens when you build something from nothing." Then he'd glance at me with contempt. Unlike some people who just sit around waiting for handouts. The handouts he was referring to? That monthly $400 that he doled out like he was Mother Teresa herself. Money that represented less than what I spent on groceries in a week from my real budget. Sarah became emboldened by David's growing cruelty. She started weaponizing pity against me, using my supposed poverty as a way to make herself look generous and long-suffering. "We're so good to David's mother," she'd tell her book club friends while I sat nearby, pretending to read but listening to every word. "We give her spending money, we include her in family events, we even bought her those clothes she's wearing. She'd be on the street without us." The clothes comment was particularly painful because it was partially true. I was wearing the cheap outfits they'd bought me, playing my role to perfection while my real wardrobe sat unused. Designer pieces that Sarah would have killed for, hanging in a closet she didn't even know existed. But the cruelty went beyond just words. They started excluding me from family photos, claiming there wasn't room or that the lighting wasn't right where I was sitting. They served me last at meals, giving me the smallest portions while piling food high on everyone else's plates. They made me clean up after their parties while their guests looked on with a mixture of pity and disgust. "Clara can handle the dishes," Sarah would announce as I finished eating my meager portion. "She likes to feel useful, don't you, Clara?" I'd nod and smile, playing the grateful dependent while inside I burned with humiliation and rage. I'd wash their expensive dishes with hands that were shaking from anger, listening to them laugh and joke in the next room about how pathetic I was. The breaking point came during one particularly awful dinner party when Sarah's mother, a vicious woman who'd raised her daughter to be equally cruel, started in on me about my failure as a mother. "If David turned out so successful, it's despite you, not because of you," she sneered, her voice loud enough for the entire table to hear. "Look at you, no husband, no money, no dignity. What kind of example is that for a child?" The guests laughed uncomfortably, but they laughed. And David? David just sat there, Not defending me, not correcting the lies, just letting his mother-in-law tear me apart for sport while he cut his steak and nodded along. That night, as I lay in my narrow bed in that cramped apartment, I heard something that changed everything. Through the thin walls, I could hear voices from the apartment next door, David and Sarah, who'd apparently come by to discuss something they didn't want overheard at home. "We can't keep this up forever," Sarah was saying. "Having her around is embarrassing. People are starting to ask questions about why we don't just put her somewhere." "After Mother's Day," David replied. "We'll do it after Mother's Day. That gives us time to arrange everything and makes it look like we're being respectful. Put me somewhere. Like I was a piece of furniture they'd grown tired of. Like I was a problem to be solved rather than a human being who'd given David life and loved him unconditionally for 35 years. But they weren't done. Oh no, they were just getting started. The pain of discovering their plan was like a physical blow to my chest. For weeks after that overheard conversation, I walked around in a daze, trying to process the level of betrayal I was facing. My own son, the child I'd carried for 9 months, the baby I'd nursed and rocked and loved, was plotting to throw me away like garbage. But the real shock came a month later when I witnessed something that made me realize just how deep their deception ran. I'd stopped by their house unexpectedly, something I rarely did, preferring to wait for their scheduled visits, because I'd been feeling particularly lonely and thought maybe, just maybe, David might want to spend some time with his mother. I used the key they'd given me and let myself in, calling out to announce my presence. No one answered, but I could hear voices from the study upstairs. Thinking they might not have heard me, I climbed the stairs slowly, my arthritis making each step painful. But as I reached the landing, the words I heard made me freeze in place. "Once she's gone, the house is ours completely," Sarah was saying. "No more pretending to care about the crazy old woman. No more wasting money on her." "The care facility costs are manageable," David replied. "And once we sell her apartment, that'll cover most of it anyway. The important thing is getting her out of our lives for good." I crept closer to the partially open door, my heart pounding so hard I was afraid they'd hear it. "What about the monthly allowance?" Sarah asked. David laughed, actually laughed. "Are you kidding? The second she's declared incompetent, that stops. We'll have power of attorney. We control everything. She'll get whatever the facility provides and nothing more. And if she complains? Who's going to listen to a senile old woman? Besides, once she's there for a few months, the medications will keep her quiet. We'll silence her for good. Silence her for good." My own son was talking about drugging me into compliance, so he could steal what little he thought I had and abandon me to rot in some institution. I backed away from the door on shaking legs, my hand pressed to my mouth to keep from crying out. The pain was indescribable, a combination of heartbreak, rage, and disbelief that threatened to bring me to my knees right there in their hallway. But as I made my way back downstairs and out of their house, something else started growing alongside the pain. Determination. Cold, calculated determination. They thought they were dealing with a helpless old woman who had nothing and no one. They had no idea they were about to go to war with someone who had spent 40 years building an empire they didn't even know existed. If David wanted to play games with power, I was about to show him what real power looked like. The next morning, I made a phone call I hadn't made in 3 years. "Richardson, Goldman and Associates, this is Jennifer speaking." "Jennifer, this is Clara Matthews. I need to speak with Robert immediately." There was a pause, then excitement in her voice. "Mrs. Matthews. Of course, let me put you right through." Robert Richardson had been my attorney for over 20 years. He'd also been sworn to secrecy about my real financial situation, a secret that was about to become very, very relevant. "Clara," Robert's warm voice came through the phone. "It's been too long. How are you holding up?" "I've been better," I said, settling into the uncomfortable chair in my tiny kitchen. "Robert, I need you to gather all the documents. Everything we've kept hidden. It's time." There was another pause, longer this time. "Are you sure? Once we do this, there's no going back. They're planning to have me declared incompetent and committed, I told him, my voice steady despite the pain in my chest. My own son wants to drug me into silence so he can steal what he thinks is my life savings. Jesus Christ, Clara. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Don't be sorry, Robert. Just help me show them exactly who they've been messing with. Within 2 hours, I was sitting in Robert's office, the same office where I'd planned my financial strategy decades ago, watching him spread documents across his massive oak desk. Documents that told a very different story than the one David and Sarah thought they knew. The mansion they lived in? Purchased by a trust I'd established, with David listed as a beneficiary but not an owner. The luxury cars in their driveway? Registered to shell companies I controlled. The construction business David was so proud of building from nothing, funded entirely by investments from companies I owned through a web of legal entities designed to keep my involvement hidden. The beauty of this structure, Robert explained, pointing to the corporate documents, is that David genuinely believes he built all this himself. The money came through so many intermediaries that he has no idea it originated from you. My accountant, Margaret Thorne, arrived an hour later with bankers' boxes full of additional documentation. Margaret had been managing my real finances while I played the role of the impoverished mother. She was a sharp woman in her 50s who'd helped me build wealth while my son thought I was barely surviving. The current portfolio value is approximately $47 million, Margaret said, opening her laptop and pulling up spreadsheets. That includes the real estate holdings, stock investments, and the controlling interests in 12 different companies. $47 million. While David was bragging about giving me $400 a month to keep me fed. What about the recordings? I asked Robert. Already arranged. I've had a private investigator friend of mine outfit you with a device that'll capture everything clearly. The beauty is it's completely legal. You're allowed to record conversations you're part of, and since they'll be talking to you about their plans, everything will be admissible if this goes to court. For the next 3 weeks, I gathered evidence. I recorded David and Sarah discussing their timeline for having me committed. I captured Sarah talking to her mother about how they'd finally be rid of the old burden. I documented David's business partner Marcus discussing how they'd handle the transition once I was out of the picture. The most damning recording came from a dinner where they thought I'd gone to bed early. I sat at the top of the stairs, my recording device capturing every word as they laid out their entire plan. The doctor's already on board, Sarah was saying. Dr. Martinez owes David a favor from when we gave his son that construction job. He'll sign whatever competency evaluation we need. And the facility? David asked. Shady Oaks. It's cheap, and they're not too picky about asking questions. Once she's there, they'll keep her medicated enough that she won't cause problems. What about her stuff? That apartment is a dump, but there might be something worth selling. Sarah laughed. What could she possibly have? But we'll go through it anyway. Might get a few hundred for the furniture. A few $100s. For the belongings of a woman who'd given them everything. As I listened to them plan my imprisonment and degradation, something crystallized inside me. This wasn't just about money anymore. This wasn't even about the years of abuse and humiliation. This was about justice. This was about showing the world exactly who these people really were when they thought no one with power was watching. Mother's Day was 2 weeks away. They were planning to make their move on Mother's Day, thinking it would be the perfect cover for their difficult decision to put their beloved mother in care. How fitting that Mother's Day would be when I destroyed them instead. The morning of Mother's Day, I woke up in my cramped apartment for what I knew would be the last time. By evening, either I'd be vindicated or I'd be on my way to the fate David and Sarah had planned for me. But I wasn't going down without a fight. I dressed carefully in the clothes they'd bought me, a cheap floral dress that made me look frail and helpless. I styled my gray hair the way Sarah preferred it, pulled back severely to emphasize my age. I applied just enough makeup to look like I was trying to maintain dignity while clearly failing. Every detail was designed to reinforce their image of me as a pathetic old woman who needed their charity. David picked me up at noon, barely looking at me as I climbed into his car. "Big day today, Mom," he said as we drove toward his house. "We have some news to share with you." "Oh." I kept my voice light, interested. "Good news, I hope?" "The best," Sarah chimed in from the passenger seat. "We've found you a wonderful place to live. Much better than that awful apartment. You'll have nurses to take care of you, activities to keep you busy, other people your age to talk to." "It sounds lovely," I said softly. "When would this happen?" "Well, that's the exciting part," David said, his voice taking on that false cheerfulness he used when he was lying. "We've arranged for you to move in today, right after dinner. We've already packed your things and handled all the paperwork." They'd already packed my things. They'd arranged everything without asking me, without giving me a choice, without even telling me until the day they planned to ship me off. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. "That's very thoughtful of you both," I managed to say. When we arrived at the house, I saw immediately that this wasn't going to be a quiet family dinner. There were a dozen cars in the driveway, and I could hear voices and laughter from inside. They'd invited an audience for my destruction. "We thought you'd want to celebrate with everyone," Sarah said, linking her arm through mine with fake affection. "All your favorite people are here." My favorite people. David's business associates who'd always treated me like furniture. Sarah's family who delighted in mocking me. Friends who saw me as an embarrassing burden to be pitted and ignored. But there was one face I didn't recognize, a middle-aged man in a rumpled suit who was speaking quietly with David near the kitchen. "Who's that?" I asked Sarah. "Oh, that's Dr. Martinez. He's here to help with your transition to the new facility. He'll need to do a quick evaluation, just a formality really, to make sure we're getting you the right level of care." Dr. Martinez. The doctor who owed David a favor and would sign whatever competency evaluation they needed. They'd brought their corrupt doctor to the dinner to make it official, to have witness testimony that poor Clara was clearly unfit to make her own decisions. I smiled and nodded like the obedient old woman they expected me to be. "How wonderful that you've thought of everything." Dinner was a 3-hour exercise in psychological torture. I was seated at a card table they'd set up in the corner, not even the wobbly stool this time, but completely separated from the main dining table where the real family sat. I was served a small portion of plain chicken and vegetables while everyone else enjoyed the elaborate feast spread before them. The conversation flowed around me like I wasn't there. Business talk that excluded me. Family gossip that painted me as a burden. Jokes at my expense that had the whole table laughing while I sat alone, picking at my meager meal. Dr. Martinez made a show of observing me throughout dinner, taking notes on a clipboard and shaking his head sadly when people asked about my condition. "These cases are always difficult," he said loudly enough for me to hear. "The family wants to help, but sometimes the kindest thing is professional care." As dessert was being served, expensive pastries that I wasn't offered, David stood up and tapped his wine glass with a knife. "Everyone, I have an announcement to make," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room. "Today, we celebrate a new beginning for our beloved mother." Beloved mother. The words tasted like poison in the air. As many of you know, Mom has been struggling lately. Memory issues, confusion, difficulty managing her daily life. It's been heartbreaking to watch. Murmurs of sympathy rippled around the table. I saw people nodding knowingly, shooting me pitying glances. But Sarah and I have found the perfect solution. Today, we're moving Mom to a beautiful retirement villa where she'll get the care and attention she deserves. Professional nurses, structured activities, a safe environment where she can't hurt herself or get confused. The applause started immediately. People were actually clapping for my imprisonment, believing they were witnessing an act of filial devotion instead of calculated cruelty. "We'll miss having her around, of course," Sarah added, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. "But we have to think about what's best for her, not what's easiest for us." More applause. More sympathetic murmurs. More praise for their sacrifice and generosity. Dr. Martinez cleared his throat. "I've had the opportunity to observe Mrs. Matthews throughout the evening, and I have to say, I think this is absolutely the right decision. She clearly needs more supervision than a family can provide. That was my cue. The moment I'd been waiting for, preparing for, building toward for months. I reached into my purse and pulled out the black leather folder I'd brought. I stood up slowly, letting my chair scrape against the floor loud enough to get everyone's attention. Then I walked to the main dining table and placed the folder right in the center, next to the elaborate centerpiece Sarah was so proud of. Actually, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the now silent room, today you'll all meet the real Clara. The silence that followed my words was so complete I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Every face at that table was turned toward me, ranging from confused to annoyed to slightly alarmed. David looked like he wanted to drag me back to my corner table, while Sarah's face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. "Mom, this isn't the time," David said, his voice tight with warning. "We're trying to have a nice dinner here." "Oh, but it's the perfect time," I replied, my hands steady as I opened the black folder. "You see, everyone here tonight has been operating under some serious misconceptions about me. About who I am, what I have, and what I'm capable of." I pulled out the first document, the deed to the house we were sitting in, and placed it on the table where everyone could see it. "This is the deed to this house. The house you've all been so impressed with, the house David loves to brag about building with his own success." I turned to look directly at my son, watching the color drain from his face. "David, would you like to read the name on the ownership line?" His hands were shaking as he picked up the document. His lips moved silently as he read, then he looked up at me with an expression of total confusion. "I don't understand," he whispered. "Read it out loud, David, so everyone can hear." It says the property is owned by the Matthews Family Trust, with Clara Matthews as the primary trustee. His voice cracked on my name. The murmurs around the table started immediately. People were leaning forward, straining to see the document, whispering questions to each other. "That's right," I said, pulling out the next set of papers. "The house you live in, David, the house you've been so proud of, was purchased with my money through a trust one established 25 years ago. You're listed as a beneficiary, not an owner." Sarah grabbed the papers from David's hands, her eyes scanning frantically. "This has to be a mistake. This has to be some kind of forgery." "I can assure you it's not," I said, pulling out more documents. "Would you like to see the vehicle registrations next? The 3 luxury cars in your driveway are all registered to shell companies I control through the same trust structure." I spread the car documents across the table like playing cards. The Mercedes David drove so proudly. The BMW Sarah loved to show off. The vintage Corvette they brought out for special occasions. All mine. Or perhaps you'd prefer to see the corporate documents for Matthews Construction? I continued, enjoying the way David's mouth was opening and closing like a fish out of water. "The company you've been telling everyone you built from nothing?" The business documents were thick, incorporation papers, investment agreements, loan documents, all showing the same pattern. Money flowing from my companies to fund David's independent success. Every major contractor company has landed in the past 5 years came through connections I arranged. I continued, my voice growing stronger with each revelation. "Every loan you've received was backed by collateral I provided. Every lucky break you've had was because I was pulling strings behind the scenes." Dr. Martinez was frantically packing up his clipboard and papers, clearly realizing he was in the middle of something he wanted no part of. But I wasn't done with him yet. "Dr. Martinez, please don't leave just yet. I think you'll find this next part particularly interesting." I pulled out my phone and opened the audio recording app. 3 weeks ago, I recorded a conversation between David and Sarah where they discussed how you would provide a false competency evaluation in exchange for business favors. Would you like me to play that for everyone? The doctor's face went white. "I don't know what you're talking about. I was simply here as a friend to offer professional advice." "Really? Should I play the recording where Sarah specifically mentions that you owe David a favor and will sign whatever competency evaluation we need?" I have to go, Dr. Martinez stammered, grabbing his coat and rushing toward the door. I have an emergency call. The room erupted in whispers and shocked exclamations as the doctor fled. But I wasn't finished. Since we're sharing recordings, I said, pulling up another file on my phone, let me play you something David and Sarah said just last week about their plans for me. I pressed play, and suddenly the room was filled with their voices discussing my imprisonment, their plans to drug me into compliance, their casual dismissal of my humanity. Sarah's laughter as she talked about finally being rid of the old burden. David's cold calculation as he planned to steal what he thought was my life savings. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see people looking back and forth between David and Sarah and me, trying to process what they'd just heard. These were the same people who had just been applauding their generosity in caring for me. Sarah broke first. That's taken out of context, she shrieked, her perfect composure finally cracking. We were just trying to figure out what was best for her. She's been acting confused, saying strange things. Confused? I asked, pulling out bank statements and investment portfolios. Let me show you just how confused I am. I spread Margaret's financial reports across the table, statements showing a net worth of $47 million, investment portfolios that had been growing for decades, ownership stakes in companies across 3 states. These are my actual finances, I announced to the stunned room. While you've all been pitying me for living on David's charity, I've been one of the wealthiest women in this city. The $400 a month David gives me with such fanfare? I spend more than that on wine in a week at my real home. The gasps were audible now. People were standing up, leaning over each other to see the documents. Sarah's mother, the woman who had called me a failure and a bad example, was staring at the bank statements with her mouth hanging open. You want to know what kind of mother I am? I continued, my voice rising with years of suppressed anger. I'm the kind of mother who spent 40 years building wealth so my son would have every advantage in life. I'm the kind of mother who secretly funded his business when he couldn't get legitimate investors. I'm the kind of mother who bought him a house and cars and a lifestyle while pretending to be poor so he could feel proud of his independence. I turned to face David directly, letting him see the full force of my fury for the first time. I'm the kind of mother who loved her son so much that I was willing to live in poverty and endure years of abuse just to preserve his dignity. And you repaid that love by planning to drug me and lock me away so you could steal what you thought was my last few dollars. The pain in my chest was overwhelming, but I pushed through it. I had to finish this. The problem was never money, David. The problem was never my competency or my ability to care for myself. The problem is who you became when you thought someone had nothing to give you. The problem is what you're willing to do to people you see as powerless. What followed was the most beautiful chaos I'd ever witnessed. Sarah's parents, who had spent years mocking my poverty while living in a house I'd paid for, were now frantically whispering to each other about property values and investment opportunities. The sudden realization that they'd been insulting one of the wealthiest women in the city while enjoying her hospitality had rendered them speechless. David's business associates, who had tolerated my presence at gatherings while discussing deals worth millions, were now looking at me with a mixture of awe and terror. They were smart enough to realize that if I controlled the money behind Matthew's construction, I controlled their futures too. Sarah herself had collapsed into her chair, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face as she stared at the financial documents spread across the table. This can't be real, she kept whispering. This can't be real. But David was staring at me like he was seeing a stranger. His face had gone through several color changes, from pale to red to gray, and his hands were shaking as he picked up document after document. You let me believe. He started, then stopped. All these years, you let me think I was taking care of you. You were supposed to be taking care of me, I replied, my voice steady despite the emotions churning inside me. That's what children do for their parents. Not because they have to, but because they want to. Because they love them. But if you had all this money, why didn't you tell me? Why did you live like that? The question hung in the air, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Because I wanted to see who you really were when you thought I had nothing to offer you, I said. I wanted to know if the son I raised with love and sacrifice would show that same love to me when I was vulnerable. I gestured to the room full of shocked faces. Instead, I got 3 years of humiliation, abuse, and cruelty. I got plans to drug me and lock me away. I got a son who was counting the days until he could throw away the mother who gave him everything. David's face crumpled. Mom, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. If I had known. If you had known, you would have treated me well because of my money, not because I'm your mother. That's exactly the problem, David. You think love should be conditional on what someone can do for you. I pulled out my phone and made the first call while everyone watched. Margaret? It's Clara. Yes, it's time. Cancel the monthly transfers to David Matthews immediately. All of them. I paused, looking directly at my son. And Margaret? Cancel the allowance cards for Sarah Matthews as well. Both the jewelry account and the shopping account. Effective immediately. Sarah let out a sound like a wounded animal. You can't do that. That's my money. No, Sarah. That was my money that I was foolish enough to give to you through my son. But that ends today. I made the second call. Robert? Clara Matthews. I need you to initiate the property transfer protocols we discussed. Yes, all of them. I looked around the room, making sure everyone could hear. I want David and Sarah Matthews given 30 days notice to vacate the house. They'll need to arrange their own housing going forward. David lurched to his feet. Mom, you can't. We have nowhere to go. You have exactly the same place I've been living for 3 years, wherever you can afford with your own money. The third call was to Marcus, David's business partner, but I spoke loud enough for the whole room to hear. Marcus, this is Clara Matthews. I'm calling to inform you that as of tomorrow morning, I'll be assuming direct control of Matthews Construction. David will be transitioning out of his management role. I paused, watching Marcus's face turn pale. Since your partnership agreement was dependent on David's position, you might want to start looking for new opportunities. Marcus dropped his wine glass, the expensive crystal shattering on Sarah's perfect hardwood floors. You can't do this, David said, his voice rising to nearly a shout. That's my company. I built that company. You built it with my money, using my connections, backed by my collateral. The legal documents are very clear about the ownership structure. You were always an employee, David. A well-paid employee, but an employee nonetheless. Sarah was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks as she grabbed at the financial documents like they might save her somehow. Please, she begged. Please, we can change. We can be better. We didn't know. You didn't know I had money, I corrected her. But you knew I was a human being who deserved basic dignity and respect. You knew I was David's mother who had loved and raised him. You knew I was an elderly woman who needed kindness, not cruelty. You just didn't care because you thought I was powerless. I gathered up my documents and placed them back in the black folder. The difference between us, Sarah, is that when I thought you had nothing to offer me, I still treated you with basic human decency. I still welcomed you into my family. I still gave you gifts and kindness, because that's what good people do. I stood up from the table, looking around at all the faces staring at me, some shocked, some guilty, some calculating what this meant for their own relationships with me. This dinner is over, I announced. David, Sarah, you have 30 days to remove your belongings from my house. After that, anything left behind will be donated to charity. I headed toward the door, then paused and turned back one more time. Oh, and David? Don't bother calling or showing up at my apartment. You won't find me there. I'm moving back to my real home tonight, the penthouse you never knew existed. The one that's been sitting empty for 3 years while I played the role of your charity case. As I walked out of that house, my house. For the last time, I could hear the chaos erupting behind me. Voices raised in argument, Sarah's sobs, David's angry shouting, and the murmurs of guests who were probably already planning how to spin this story when they got home. I didn't look back. 6 months later, I'm sitting in my real home, a penthouse apartment overlooking the city, with floor-to-ceiling windows and furnishings that Sarah would have killed for writing this story because I think it needs to be told. The immediate aftermath was everything I had expected and more. David and Sarah lost the house, the cars, the lifestyle they'd become accustomed to. Sarah's jewelry collection, bought with my money, had to be sold piece by piece to pay for their new living expenses. David's business partners abandoned him once they realized he had no real capital or connections of his own. Dr. Martinez lost his medical license after I reported his willingness to falsify competency evaluations. That recording I made turned out to be very useful to the state medical board. Sarah's parents, who had spent years mocking my poverty, suddenly became very interested in maintaining a relationship with me once they understood my real financial position. I politely but firmly declined their invitations to lunch and their sudden expressions of regret for past behavior. But the hardest part, the part that still keeps me awake some nights, is David himself. He tried to contact me dozens of times in those first weeks. Phone calls I didn't answer, emails I deleted without reading, visits to my building where the doorman turned him away on my instructions. He even tried reaching out through mutual acquaintances, begging for just one conversation, one chance to explain and apologize. I almost weakened a few times. There were moments when I remembered the little boy he used to be, the son who would bring me flowers from the neighbor's garden and tell me I was the best mommy in the world. But then I would remember his voice on those recordings, the casual cruelty with which he planned my imprisonment, the laughter as he discussed drugging me into compliance. They don't understand that the money was never the real issue. The real issue was discovering that the child you raised with love and sacrifice would show you no love or sacrifice in return when he thought you had nothing to offer him. I've used my wealth to start a foundation for older adults who are being abused or exploited by family members. You'd be amazed how common it is, children who see their aging parents as burdens to be managed rather than people to be loved. Families who view elderly relatives as obstacles to inheritance rather than human beings deserving of dignity. The foundation provides legal assistance, financial planning services, and safe housing for older adults trying to escape abusive family situations. We've helped dozens of people in just 6 months, and every case reminds me why I had to do what I did. Because staying silent doesn't protect anyone. Hiding your strength doesn't preserve relationships, it just enables abuse. And sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is to show them the consequences of their choices before those choices destroy them completely. I still have days when I wonder if David might have changed if I'd handled things differently. But then I remember that I gave him 3 years to show me who he really was when he thought I was powerless. 3 years to demonstrate basic human decency to his mother. 3 years to treat me with love instead of contempt. He failed that test not because he lacked resources or opportunities, but because he lacked character. And character isn't something you can buy with money or fix with apologies after you've been caught. My real legacy isn't the wealth I accumulated over 40 years of work and investment. It's not the companies I own or the properties I've acquired. My real legacy is the lesson I've taught about what happens when people mistake kindness for weakness, when they confuse vulnerability with worthlessness. I hid my power until it was time to reveal it. And when I did, everything changed not just for me, but for everyone who thought they could abuse someone they saw as powerless. If you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or treated as invisible, this story is for you. Subscribe to my channel because staying silent only lets cruelty grow. Your voice matters, your dignity matters, and you have more power than the people hurting you want you to realize. And if you've watched this entire story and still don't subscribe, tell me why in the comments. What part of my story cut deepest for you? Was it the years of humiliation I endured? The moment I discovered their plan to imprison me? Or the look on my son's face when he realized that the powerless old woman he'd been tormenting was actually the one holding all the power? Because that moment, that single moment when the truth was revealed, that's when everything changed. That's when justice finally arrived. And that's when I learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. Sometimes the best revenge is simply letting people face the natural consequences of who they've chosen to be. My name is Clara. I'm 64 years old. And I want everyone to know that being kind doesn't mean being weak, being generous doesn't mean being stupid, and being vulnerable doesn't mean being powerless. It just means you're human. And humanity, real humanity, is the most powerful force in the world.